Good morning. How's everyone doing? You doing all right? Braving the cold? Y'all, I don't know what happened. It's like I brought Colorado with me to Austin this morning or something, but y'all are brave. I see so many t-shirts, so thank you. Solidarity. It's good. Hey, I'm so excited to get to spend the morning with y'all, and if you're joining us online and we've never had a chance to meet, my name is Ross. I'm the campus pastor here at North. Really good to be with you this morning as we continue, like Isaiah said, in this series we've been in over the last several weeks and we'll be in until we hit Easter in a couple of weeks. We're calling it The Road Once Traveled, where we're taking a closer look at the final moments of Jesus' life, the final moments of Jesus' story that lead to ultimately a cross and a tomb and then rising from the dead 3 days later, which we get to celebrate in a couple weeks at Easter. And as we've been studying through this particular book of the Bible, the Gospel of Mark, which is one of four Gospels or biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we've been learning together that there is so much more than what Jesus just showed up saying, what Jesus showed up doing. We're learning as we journey through the book of Mark, and specifically this window of time into Jesus' final moments, we're learning more about who Jesus is. We're learning more about who he is as a person, and that's really important because as much as the teaching, as much as the miracles reveal to us and Jesus' audience, his followers, then something about what Jesus is up to, ultimately we're trying to learn who is this man named Jesus? Why does his story matter? And why should his story matter for me, for us? Today, we're learning to look at Jesus and study the kinds of things he said, the kinds of people he loved, the kinds of things he fought for, so that we understand his character. So that we understand his character. We have to understand not just what Jesus came to do, but who Jesus actually is. Because his why, Jesus' why, as in, here is why I came, informed everything that we see him doing, everything we see him speaking, and so on. And so we're going to dive into some scripture pretty quickly today because we have a lot of ground to cover in a short amount of time. And we're going to look at this passage together. If you brought a Bible, which I've loved seeing so many physical Bibles in the room on Sundays. If you have a Bible app, this is all going to be on the screen as well. We're going to be in the book of Mark, chapter 14. If you want to start getting there, the story we're going to be looking at, it moves in three distinct movements, or I've been kind of referring to them as these three distinct phases. And so we're going to break those down together. We're going to study the story by going a little bit slower. And we're ultimately going to see what we can learn about how and why this particular story was put together the way that it was. Because I don't know if you know this, but anytime you see anything written by one of the gospel writers, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, anytime you see them writing anything, they are writing it very intentionally. From the words they're using to the order that they tell the stories, they want us as the readers, as the listeners, to pay attention to not just what is being said, but how it's flowing, because oftentimes there's a narrative lurking just beneath the surface that we can learn from. And so, as we'll learn in this story, nothing we see happening is happening by accident. And ultimately, this story helps us understand who Jesus is, why his story matters for us. And so let's just dive into it. This is Mark chapter 14, beginning in verse 12. Here we go. It goes like this. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So he sent two of his disciples, telling them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Say to the owner of the house he enters, the teacher asks, 'Where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there." And so the disciples left. They went into the city and they found things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover. Now, quick time out before we go any further, because we have to understand some of the context of what's happening in this particular story. If for no other reason, to understand some of the language being used. I mean, you've got phrases and things being talked about like festival of unleavened bread and Passover lamb. There's something very specific that's happening, something very specific that's taking place, and it's our job to understand what that is. And so to understand some of that context, we have to go back in time to the Old Testament. And this is specifically in Exodus chapter 12. If you want, you can go back and read that chapter later today. And just to kind of give a brief summary of what's happening in Exodus chapter 12, we find the Israelites still captive in Egypt. Right? And so the Israelites are under the rule, under the oppression of the Egyptians. And up to this point in the story, Moses and his brother Aaron have gone before Pharaoh 9 times to famously tell him, let my people go, right? And each of those 9 times, we see Pharaoh responding similarly. He might tell Moses and Aaron no. He might tell them yes, that turns into a no, but ultimately these 9 times, Moses and Aaron have gone before Pharaoh, let my people go, and the response is no. And in response to that, God sends plagues, right? You've maybe read these stories, heard these stories, and up to this point, we've seen 9 plagues been unleashed on the land of Egypt, and God is about to unleash a 10th. God is about to unleash a 10th plague, and so he gives the Israelites some very specific instructions. He says, hey, I want you to take a lamb without blemish, and I want you to sacrifice that lamb, and I want you to take some of the blood from that lamb and paint your door frame with the blood. And we might ask, like, well, man, that sounds a little bit intense. That's a lot of lambs. Where'd they get all those lambs? There's a lot going on here, but God is very specific. This is what I want you to do. And God goes on to explain that the reason why I want you to do this is because I, God, am going to pass through the land of Egypt. And for every home, for every family, for every household where I see a doorframe covered in the blood of the lamb, God says, I will pass over that house. It's where we get Passover. God literally passes over those homes. But for those homes that have not sacrificed the lamb, for those families who are not covered in the blood of the lamb, God says, I am going to strike down the firstborn of that family, be it a firstborn child, firstborn animal. God says, I will make no distinction. And so God does exactly what he says he's going to do. He moves throughout the land of Egypt, and for every home where he sees blood, life is spared, but for every home where he does not, life is taken. And this is ultimately what prompts Pharaoh to look back at Moses and Aaron and say, I have had enough. Like, please, just take your people and go. And so the Israelites do. In fact, they go out of Egypt so quickly that in their fleeing, they grab whatever food they can, which just happens to be these balls of dough that's unleavened dough, which means it's dough without yeast. And so this journey begins with God moving in spectacular fashion, and the Israelites are only eating this dough of unleavened bread. And so God asks the Israelite nation from that point every year onward to celebrate this moment. It's why the beginning of 8 days of celebrating the Passover begins with the festival of unleavened bread. All of this is a callback. All of this is setting up what is happening in our story, because what Jesus want our attention hyper-focused on is this moment in Israel's history where God brought freedom from captivity, where God brought hope in the midst of bondage. And so let's hang on to that idea. It's a lot of historical context, I know that, and some of you are like, where are we going with this? I'll tell you. What's really interesting about this moment in time is that God is bringing all of the Jewish people back to Jerusalem to celebrate this moment. And in fact, if we were to look at this story in Mark chapter 14, what's really fascinating is this story in Mark chapter 14 is almost identical to another story found in Mark chapter 11. And in fact, we actually looked at this story from Mark chapter 11 a couple of weeks ago. So maybe this language is already starting to sound familiar to some of us, but I want to do a really quick review. In Mark chapter 11, Jesus looks at a couple of his disciples and he says, hey, I want you to go into Jerusalem and I want you to find a donkey or a colt tied to the fence. I want you to ask the owner if I can borrow it. I want you to bring the donkey to me. And this is the donkey or the colt that Jesus famously rides into Jerusalem on during his triumphal entry. People are shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. People are excited. And here's the thing, what happens in Mark chapter 11 is almost identical to what happens in our story. Think about it. Jesus tells 2 of his disciples to go into a city, to find something, and to ask to use it. Go back to our story. The exact same thing happens, literally down to the exact same Greek language being used in both stories. It's kind of unbelievable. Jesus, in our story, tells two disciples to go into a city, Jerusalem, same city, to find something very specific, this man carrying a jar of water, which would have been totally obvious to the disciples because carrying jugs of water was typically something they would see a woman do. And Jesus tells them, hey, I want you to ask for something very specific. In this case, an upper room for us to share the Passover. Mark 11, Mark 14, they're identical stories. Two disciples sent into a city to find a thing and bring it back to Jesus, right? And so the question becomes, because I've been reading this over and over this week, it actually gets cooler if you peel back a few more layers. What's interesting is Mark, the writer of the Gospel of Mark, captured these two stories very intentionally because he wants us to notice the similarities. He wants us to hold both stories and say, well, they're kind of the same. In fact, you could dive even deeper. That means that Jesus orchestrated these events to happen the exact same way. Why? Why would Jesus want these two stories playing out the exact same way? Why would Mark be so intent on us gleaning this from the text? Why do Jesus and Mark hold these two stories side by side as if to say, pay attention? And here's why. These two stories are only different in how they end. And when you take those two endings of the stories and put them together, you get a new story entirely. Mark chapter 11, Jesus ends the story by passing judgment on the temple. You've maybe heard this story. Jesus walks in with a whip. He's overturning tables. There's animals running everywhere. The religious people are mad, right? And so the question becomes, how does our story in Mark 14 end? Well, we haven't gotten that far yet, have we? One more thing to pay attention to before we go on to the next movement is all of the secrecy that we see Jesus exhibiting. He's basically telling his disciples, hey, I want you to go into Jerusalem. You're going to find a guy. I'm not going to tell you his name. He's going to be carrying a jar of water. I want you to follow him to another guy's house. Not going to tell you his name. I want you to go to that guy and I want you to ask him if we can borrow his guest room. And he's going to tell you yes, as if the whole thing has been planned. And you got to imagine the disciples are like, what are you talking about? Again? Like we're going to do this again? It seems a little suspicious, or here's what I think. Jesus really wants this meal to happen. Jesus really wants this meal to happen. All the secrecy, which goes against Jesus' normal MO of speaking plainly, speaking bluntly to at least his disciples, which are the people he's speaking to in this case. All the planning, it's like Jesus is going out of his way to make sure that this meal happens. Why? Because how the story ends matters. See, if the reason why Jesus really wants the Passover meal to happen is because he is going to use this moment in history to make a point, and he really wants this point to be made in a particular way, the next question we should be thinking in our minds is, what is Jesus so concerned about that would keep this meal from happening? Like, what is Jesus worried about? Let's keep reading. Verse 17, this is the beginning of the second movement of our story. It goes like this. When evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12. So they're arriving under the cover of darkness, more secrecy. Verse 18, while they were reclining at the table eating, he, Jesus, said, truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. The disciples were saddened, and one by one they said to him, surely you don't mean me. It is one of the 12, he replied, one who dips bread into the bowl with me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him, but woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born. And there's our answer. What is Jesus concerned about? He is concerned about the traitor, the betrayer in their midst. In fact, if we read 2 verses immediately before our story begins in Mark chapter 14, we get an even clearer picture of the threat against Jesus being able to have this Passover meal with his disciples. This is Mark 14, verse 10. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money, so he, Judas, watched for an opportunity to hand him over. See, Judas probably knew that Jesus would want to gather his disciples, that he would be with them in Jerusalem at the time of Passover. The law was that in order to consume this meal, the Passover meal, one had to do it within the walls of Jerusalem, which means for us, we can know that Judas knew where Jesus was going to be, roughly, and he knew when Jesus would be there. He just didn't know, along with none of the 12 other disciples, exactly where in the city of Jerusalem that Jesus would be. But regardless, Judas knew this is the opportunity I've been looking for. This is the opportunity. And I think Jesus intentionally kept all of them out of the loop because he knew this. I think this explains all of the secrecy. Jesus knew the stakes were high. His desire was to have this meal with his disciples. He knew that there was an active threat against that possibility, that reality. Ultimately, Jesus also knew that where this story goes is to the cross, to a tomb. But in this particular moment, Jesus is going out of his way to preserve this moment against a very real and a very active threat. And all of this brings us back to where this story is going, right? Jesus is on high alert. Mark wants us to notice the similarities between two stories. Where is Jesus going with this? What is the point he is trying to make? Mark clearly wants us to see it. And so thus begins the third movement in this story. This is what we've been building up to. This is what Jesus wants our attention on. Look at this, verse 22. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take it. This is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly, I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." And we have to understand that what Jesus is saying here would have been shocking. It would have been shocking. We maybe don't read it that way, either because we've never been taught to read it that way, which is totally fine, or we have, and we've just read this story so many times by now that we've forgotten what is actually happening. Let me see if I can make an analogy for us today. This would be like you going home this December to Christmas with your family, with your friends, whatever that looks like. And as people are gathered around the tree or the dinner table, right, you stand up in the midst of all of your friends, all of your relatives, and you say something like, "Hey everyone, I want to make an announcement. I know that for the past however long I've been alive, we've celebrated this holiday the same way, and we look forward to the traditions every single year, the ugly sweaters, the eggnog, the lights, the tree, the presents, whatever that is." That'd be like you telling your family, "I know all of that's true, but I want us from this point on to make Christmas about me." Here's my question. How would that go over in your house? Here's what I think. Best case scenario, you're getting laughed at. Or like blank stares, right? Because people think you're joking. Worst case scenario, you don't get invited back. And some of you are in the room, you're like, I'm okay with that, actually. You might try it. I don't recommend it, but hey. But do you see the audacity? Do you see the audacity of what Jesus is doing? Jesus is basically saying, hey, you know that freedom and liberation that God brought to our people in spectacular fashion? You know how God moved in mighty ways? You know how our people have been celebrating that for literally over 1,000 years? Remember how God told us to celebrate every single year what he did to usher in a new nation called Israel? Jesus is saying, I want you to, in spite of all of that, I want you to make this about me. I want you to, when we celebrate this meal, this moment in our nation's history, I want you to remember me. And here's the thing, we might know what happens in Jesus' story, right? The cross, the tomb, the rising from the grave, but the disciples don't. The disciples don't know that that's what's going to happen, but the thing is, Jesus has been dropping hints. He's been leaving this breadcrumb trail for those who would pay attention, much like for us this morning, which is what we've been talking about all morning so far. And so how do our two stories from Mark 11 and Mark 14 tell a third story? Well, again, let's review. Mark 11 ends with Jesus flipping the temple on its head. right? That web of religious rule following and self-righteousness, Jesus literally flips it on its head and then he walks away as if to say, I'm going to bring you something different, which is how our story in Mark 14 ends. Jesus says, I'm about to usher in a new kind of kingdom. I'm about to inaugurate a new kind of kingdom, a kingdom that was paid for by my body, by my blood. Jesus says, I'm about to make a new kind of life and freedom possible by my body being broken, my blood being spilled. Jesus is basically saying like, hey, you know that old system of religious rule following that actually hurt more people than it ever served? I'm going to bring something better. Jesus said, hey, you know that old version of the temple, which basically now stands as this monument to human institutions? Jesus says, I'm going to become the new temple. Jesus says, hey, all those reasons we've had to celebrate God bringing us from captivity into freedom, Jesus says, I'm about to bring you a whole new level of freedom, a better reason to celebrate. I could sum all of that up by saying this: the old broken way of doing things is ending. And Jesus says, I'm offering you something better, me. Jesus says the old broken way of doing religion, of doing life, it is coming to an end. What's going to replace it? Me. So who is Jesus? Why does this story matter for us today? Jesus is the Son of God. He came, he lived a perfect, sinless life so that he could die as the payment for the debt of sin that you and I could never pay, be buried in a tomb, rise from that tomb 3 days later in order to reconnect us back into God's family and where we might experience abundant, eternal life now, not just someday after our funeral, but right now, from now on. Jesus says you might want to pay attention because all of the broken ways that you've been trying to live your life can end, and I will bring you something better, me. I can bring you something better. And so the question becomes, what do we do with that? What do we do with that? Because I don't know about you, but for me, when I think about the ways that Jesus might want to move in the still broken parts of my life, and I think about the vision for hope and freedom that he's set before me, and I'm trying to connect the dots between how do we get from here to there, Jesus. Sometimes it can feel like, Jesus, where do we even start? If hope and freedom is the vision, if that's what you've made possible, where do we even start? And so I have a few questions for us that I think might help us get started. And my challenge as one of your pastors is whether you've been following Jesus for a lifetime or you're just exploring what that even means, my challenge would be lean into these questions, be honest with yourself in how you would answer these questions, and be okay with sitting in the discomfort, because I got to be honest with you, these questions might start to feel a little bit intrusive, but that's kind of the point. First question goes like this: where are you currently trying to find purpose and meaning in your life? Where are you trying to find purpose and meaning in your life? I would add a little bit to the end of that question. Where are you trying to find purpose and meaning in your life apart from Jesus? And I could maybe ask the question another way. What do you aspire your life to look like? What kind of life do you aspire to live? What kind of person do you aspire to be? Because how you answer those questions might actually reveal where you are currently trying to find meaning and purpose apart from God. It's like tracing a river upstream, right? If I know something true is here, these places I'm trying to find meaning and purpose, then what does that say about how I'm trying to live my life, the kind of person I aspire to be? And I'll give you a few examples, see if any of this resonates. Maybe right now you're trying to find purpose and meaning in being a really great spouse, really great husband, really great wife. Maybe for you it's trying to find meaning and purpose in how you raise your kids. You just want to be a really great parent. Maybe for you, you're single and the idea of finding meaning and purpose in a relationship is better than the alternative, which is a season of singleness that has gone on way longer than you thought, because how can there be purpose and meaning in that? Maybe for you, you're in a season where you're trying to find meaning and purpose in the kind of work you do or your career trajectory or how soon you can retire. Maybe you're a student or you're about to be in college and you're thinking, man, I'm going to find a lot of meaning and purpose in the kind of person that my life is built around based on what I study or how fast I study it or the title I get once I graduate or the kind of money that I'll be able to make. Maybe for you, you find meaning and purpose in the size of your bank account or how your investments are doing right now or the size of your house or how many cars you have or can buy for your kids and your grandkids, whatever that is. I need you to hear me. None of those things are inherently bad or evil things. I need you to hear that. None of those things as aspirations are necessarily bad or evil. But the more interesting question is not, are those things evil? I think the more interesting question is, to what extent do those things drive my search for hope and peace and satisfaction and meaning and purpose? Because those are some pretty heavy burdens to place on people or things that might not actually be able to deliver like we want them to or need them to. And we're basing so much of our life on the possibility that they can. So where are you currently trying to find purpose and meaning in your life apart from Jesus? Here's my next question. How's that working for you? That's what's called nervous laughter. How's that working for you? Again, just be honest. Anybody else have some brokenness in your life right now? Or is that just me? Don't raise your hand. I am. You can if you want to, but have you ever felt the pressure of trying to prove yourself? That you're smart enough, that you're good enough, that you're smart enough, that you're pretty enough, strong enough, whatever that is for you, right? Ever felt the weight of other people's expectations? Or maybe sometimes worse, the expectations you put on yourself. See, could it be that those areas of brokenness, the anxiety, the depression, the addiction, whatever you have going on in your lives, could it be that those same areas of fear, insecurity, anger are the very areas where Jesus would want to inject new levels of life, new levels of freedom? See, a couple of weeks ago, I was at the gym and it was after work and I just needed to clear my head a little bit. And so this is a place I sometimes go to do that. And I remember it was one of those weeks where I just had a lot going on in my brain, right? Some of you are like, that's tomorrow for me, right? It's one of those weeks. And I remember thinking that I was wanting to put some thought and prayer into just how I was preparing for this message, what I was going to share with you all this morning. I remember thinking about all of the work I had to catch up on from being out a couple of weeks prior. I was thinking about all of the projects that were happening here at work, all of the conversations that I needed to have with staffers, with other volunteers, with leaders. And some of these conversations weren't necessarily the really difficult kinds of conversations, but not really the fun ones either, right? And so I was rehearsing how some of those would go in my brain. I remember the night before, Xander, my son, he was up at 5 a.m. I don't know how toddlers just know that you have a lot on your plate and decide to wake up at the crack of dawn before the sun's even up, but he did. So I was tired, and as I was sitting there on this bench in the gym, I just remember feeling like, man, I'm trying to juggle a lot of balls right now. I'm trying to keep a lot of things spinning, trying to keep a lot of things in the air, and my thought process went even further than that because I made up that there was a long list of people in my life who needed me, depended on me to keep all of those things in the air, and that if somehow I even dropped one of them, I was going to let that person or those people down. And as I was sitting there contemplating all of this and my brain was starting to turn into like this whirlwind, I started to experience panic. And some of you all know this part of my story, anxiety, panic attacks. They're a relatively new part of it. And as much as I've experienced very real transformation, I am still not 100% healthy. I am healthier. Does that make sense? I'm healthier today than I was a year ago. And I was healthier a year ago than I was the year before that. But I am not 100% healthy. My point is this: even though I've experienced some real transformation by the power of the Holy Spirit in my life, through the voices of some really trusted counselors and pastors, through accountability in my life like I've never had before, I can still, in moments of stress, try to keep it all together because what plays in my head is that I have to give people what I think they want from me in order to feel like I am good enough for them. I try to give people this perfect version of Ross that I think you need in order to prove to you, and even more than that, prove to myself that I have what it takes, that I'm good enough. And all of that for me, I need you to hear this. It is a broken pattern. It is a broken system. It is a broken mindset of how I've lived my life. So what's yours? What's yours? And here's the thing, there's no shame in it. I need you to hear that. Some of us, we had to build these systems of thinking. We had to build these systems of behavior because in order to navigate some really difficult circumstances, those systems are what kept us alive. But I need you to hear also that as Jesus looks at every single one of us and says, new levels of life and freedom are possible. New levels of hope and joy and peace are possible. These things we've clung to keep us alive are exactly what they are. They are old, broken systems. And listen, there are some of us in the room that need to be reminded today that those old, broken systems cannot go where Jesus wants to take us. They just can't go with us. Which leads to my last question, and it goes like this. Where might Jesus want to bring something new in your life? Where does Jesus want to do something new? And could you imagine what that would look like? Again, chances are that the very places we try to find purpose and meaning are the very places that Jesus would look at us and say, I can do so much more than you could even imagine. I want to do something new. Because new things become possible in Jesus. New life becomes possible in Jesus. What if your addiction, your anxiety, your depression, your anger, your fear, what if those things are not how your story ends? What if the worry, what if the thoughts of how you'll never measure up to your own expectations, let alone anybody else's, are not how your story ends? New life is possible in Jesus, and it can start not just after we die and go to heaven instead of hell someday. It can start from now on. And so just like the disciples did with Jesus nearly 2,000 years ago, we're going to remember that by taking communion together. We're going to share in the bread. We're going to share in the cup. We're going to be reminded that no matter the brokenness some of us have had to walk through and are still walking through, hope and freedom are always possible in Jesus. Some of us need to be reminded of that. True and lasting hope is found in no other name, but Jesus says, I will give it to every single person who asks. Listen to how the Apostle Paul, he's writing to a church in Corinth, and he describes the exact same night that Jesus was in that upper room with his disciples. He says it like this: the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And in the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant, new promise in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. And see, we're not just remembering that Jesus once lived and died a long time ago in this cycle of like never-ending funerals. I like to imagine what Jesus' disciples must have felt after Jesus ascended into heaven and they found themselves gathered around tables, sharing in the bread, sharing in the wine, remembering their friend. He was their friend, and by sharing in those elements, being reminded, this is what he did for us, this is what he did for me, and this is what he makes possible now in our lives. See, we're remembering that Jesus' death, his dying in a grave, his being raised 3 days later, means that there is a new kind of hope available to us. Hope, life, freedom, that we could never earn on our own. Jesus says that old system of trying to prove that you're worthy, prove that you deserve love, prove that you're good enough, smart enough, brave enough, pretty enough, strong enough in whatever category you would throw out on the table and say, Jesus, this is why I shouldn't be part of what you're doing. Jesus gently brushes that away and he says, maybe you're right, but where I'm going, because of what I've done, new things become possible. And so Jesus' question to us is, do you want to go with me? See, around here we have at Gateway what we call an open table, which means this: if you've made the decision to surrender your life to Jesus, if you've raised your hand and you've said, Jesus, I want to follow you with all that I am. I believe you are the Son of God. I believe that you are who you say you are and that you can and will keep every promise you've ever made in Scripture to me, then take the bread, take the juice, be reminded that Jesus is alive. And because he's alive, there is hope, freedom, life. And if you're just checking this whole thing out, if you've not made that declaration with your life, that's okay. I hope this moment can be a reminder for you from someone like me that God is crazy about you, that he has never stopped pursuing you. And when you're ready, Jesus has done everything necessary to wipe away your sin, wipe away your brokenness, wipe away your shame, and say, hey, there's new life. Let's go. So the band is going to play this song over us. And we talked a lot about how we wanted this moment to feel, this moment to end. And we chose this song. And I got to tell you, it doesn't take very long for this song to get kind of big and kind of loud. And you might think, Ross, that's not a great moment to sit in stillness and quiet and remember Jesus. And you might be right, but I don't know about you. When I think about the places Jesus has brought me, from the brokenness, from the sin, from the shame, when I think about the kind of hope and freedom that he's still making possible in my life, for the guy who worries on a bench in the gym, there are moments where I sit in remembrance of who Jesus is, and I can't help but want to get kind of big and loud with my worship. Anybody else? So as the band leads us in this song, when you're ready, take the bread, take the juice, and then stand with us and worship loud, all right? He's worth it.